That one's finished. Ain't nothing behind those eyes anymore. I broke men stronger than him in half the time. That one gave up early. I broke men stronger than him in half the time. That one gave up early. He don't
They
even
thought the
flinch.
night would break him.
Exactly.
They thought the
That's what
cold
broken
would
looks
weaken
like.
him. The darkness would terrify him, and the silence would crush whatever strength he had left. 7 men, wealthy, powerful, and certain of their control, tied him to a tree deep in the wilderness of 1862 and walked away without looking back. No food, no water, no chance of escape. Just rope cutting into his flesh. The forest closing in around him, and the long, merciless hours stretching ahead. They believed the night itself would finish what they had started. But what they did not understand, what they would come to regret far too late, was that they had not left a broken man behind. They had left a man who still had something stronger than fear, a will that refused to die, even when everything else demanded it. Welcome to Shadows of Black History. If you are new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe and like our videos so you never miss the hidden stories that shape the past. We truly appreciate every one of you who watches and supports this journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight's story is one you must not miss, not even a single paragraph, because what you are about to hear is a chilling reminder of endurance, cruelty, and the unbreakable will to survive. So relax, settle in, and prepare yourself as we begin. The forest in 1862 did not belong to any one man, yet men with power often behaved as though it did. Deep within that stretch of land, far from towns, roads, and the reach of law, the wilderness created a kind of silence that felt endless. Tall trees rose into the dark sky, their branches twisting together so tightly that even moonlight struggled to pass through. The ground was uneven, layered with fallen leaves, roots, and damp earth that held the cold of the night long after the sun had disappeared. Sounds traveled differently there. A single movement, a snapping twig, a distant cry could echo farther than expected, then vanish just as quickly. It was a place where a man could disappear without a trace, where events could unfold without witness, and where cruelty could hide behind the cover of darkness. On that night, the forest was not simply a setting. It was part of the test, part of the punishment designed by men who believed they understood exactly how fear worked. He had been strong when they first took him. Even now, as the rope held his arms tight against the rough bark of the tree, the strength had not fully left him. His wrists were bound behind him, pulled so tightly that his shoulders burned with strain. His ankles were secured as well, leaving him unable to shift his weight without pain. The rope cut into his skin with every small movement, each knot pulled with deliberate force by hands that had no concern for the damage they caused. The tree at his back felt cold and unyielding, its surface rough against his skin, pressing into him as if it were another part of the trap itself. He tested the bindings once instinctively, pulling against them with controlled effort. But the result was immediate. The rope tightened further, biting deeper, reminding him that this was no careless restraint. This had been planned, designed, meant to hold him through the long hours ahead. He forced himself to stop struggling. Panic would only waste strength, and strength was something he could not afford to lose. The memory of how it happened still lingered in sharp fragments. The sudden hands grabbing him, the force that drove him to the ground, the weight of bodies working together to overpower him. He had fought it, of course. Any man would. His strength had surprised them, slowed them for a moment. But numbers had decided the outcome before the struggle even began. 7 men, each one certain of their power, each one acting without hesitation. They had not rushed. There had been no urgency in their movements, only control. They had tied him carefully, methodically, as if they had done this before, or at least understood exactly how to make it effective. One of them had spoken before they left, his voice calm, almost casual, explaining that the night would take care of the rest. That by morning whatever strength remained would be gone. That fear would do what force had only begun. The words had been meant to stay with him, to echo through the hours ahead, to grow heavier as the darkness deepened. And now, as the last traces of daylight faded completely, those words returned, settling into his thoughts like a shadow he could not push away. The night grew colder as it settled fully over the forest. The air shifted, losing the warmth of the day, carrying a chill that crept slowly into his body. Without movement, without the ability to generate heat, the cold became something constant, something that could not be ignored. His muscles began to stiffen, his breathing slower, controlled, as he tried to conserve what energy he could. Around him, the forest came alive in ways that only darkness could reveal. Insects chirped in uneven patterns. Leaves rustled without warning. Somewhere in the distance, an animal called out, the sound low and unfamiliar, echoing through the trees before fading into silence. Each noise pressed against his awareness, reminding him that he was not alone, yet completely alone at the same time. He closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to focus, to gather his thoughts, to hold on to something steady within himself as everything around him seemed uncertain. The men who had left him there believed the night would break him. They believed time, fear, and isolation would do their work. But as he opened his eyes again and looked into the darkness ahead, something inside him remained unshaken. The night had only just begun. The night deepened slowly, stretching itself across the forest in a way that made time feel heavier than it truly was. Minutes did not pass cleanly. They dragged, lingered, repeated themselves inside his mind until it became difficult to tell how long he had been standing there bound to the tree. The cold settled deeper into his body, creeping through his limbs, tightening his muscles, making even the smallest movement feel heavier than before. He could feel the rope more clearly now, not just as restraint but as pressure, constant and unforgiving. It pressed into his wrists, into his ankles, into the places where circulation slowed and sensation sharpened into pain. He shifted slightly, testing the limits again, not with force but with patience. The bark of the tree scraped against his back as he moved, rough and unyielding, offering no comfort, only resistance. Every part of the situation had been designed to weaken him. Still, he understood something important. The night was not his enemy. The night was simply time, and time, if endured, could also bring change. He began to listen more carefully. At first, the forest had sounded chaotic, a mix of unfamiliar noises layered over one another. But as his mind settled, patterns began to form. The insects followed rhythms. The rustling of leaves came and went with the wind. Even the distant calls of animals had a kind of order to them. Understanding those patterns mattered, because anything that broke them would mean something different, something approaching, something watching. He focused on his breathing, slow and controlled, refusing to let fear take control of it. Panic would only make the cold worse, the pain sharper, the hours longer. He had seen fear before. He had seen what it did to men who let it take hold completely. It turned strength into weakness. It turned thought into confusion. It made survival harder, not easier. So he held on to what he could control: his breath, his thoughts, his awareness. The rope remained tight, the tree remained solid, but his mind stayed his own. At some point, though he could not say exactly when, the forest shifted. It was subtle at first, a pause in the usual rhythm. The insects seemed quieter. The air felt different, heavier in a way that was not caused by the cold alone. He opened his eyes fully, focusing on the darkness ahead. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then he heard it, a faint sound, low and careful. Not the random movement of wind or falling leaves. Something was stepping through the underbrush, slow, controlled, not rushing, watching. His body tensed instinctively, though he forced himself to remain as still as possible. Whatever was out there, it was not unaware of him. It had noticed. The sound came again, slightly closer this time, followed by another. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels intentional. His heart beat harder, but his face remained steady, his breathing unchanged. He could not run. He could not fight in the way he normally would. But he could still think, still observe, still choose how to respond. From the darkness, two faint shapes appeared between the trees, low to the ground, moving with a kind of quiet precision that carried no hesitation. Wolves, or something close enough to them that the difference no longer mattered. Their eyes caught what little light filtered through the branches, reflecting faintly as they studied him. They did not rush forward. They circled slowly, keeping their distance, their movements measured. They were not afraid, but they were not careless either. They sensed something unusual. A man standing still, bound, unable to move as prey normally would. The situation did not fit their instincts, and so they waited, watching, learning. One step closer, its body low, its head tilted slightly as it tried to understand what it was seeing. The other remained farther back, observing, cautious. He did not shout. He did not try to scare them away with sudden noise. Instead, he held his ground as much as he could, his presence steady, his eyes locked forward. Fear would show weakness. Weakness would invite action. He knew this without needing to think about it. The forest had its own rules, just like the world of men. The moments stretched as the animals continued to circle, their interest growing but their uncertainty holding them back. He understood then that survival would not come from strength alone. It would come from control, from the ability to remain present, to refuse to become the helpless figure they expected. The rope held his body, but it did not define what he was in that moment. He drew in a slow breath, then another, grounding himself against the cold, the pain and the silent threat moving around him. The men who had left him there believed the night would break him. They believed the forest would turn against him. But as he stood there, facing the quiet danger circling in the darkness, something became clear. The night was not deciding his fate. He was. The wolves did not attack, not immediately. They continued to circle, slow and deliberate, testing the stillness of the man before them. Their instincts told them something was wrong. Prey did not stand upright without movement. Prey did not hold its ground without fear spilling into the air. Yet hunger has patience, and patience can turn uncertainty into opportunity. One of the animals stepped closer again, its body low, its eyes fixed, its movements careful but purposeful. The second followed, though it remained slightly behind, watching both the man and its companion. The distance between them and the tree grew smaller with each slow step. He understood what was happening. They were not waiting forever. They were learning, measuring, deciding. And if the moment came when they believed he was no longer a threat, they would act without hesitation. He could not allow that moment to come. The realization did not bring panic. It brought clarity. Standing still would no longer be enough. He needed to change what they saw. He needed to become something unpredictable, something that disrupted their understanding of him as prey. Slowly, carefully, he shifted his weight, ignoring the sharp pain that shot through his arms as the rope tightened further. The movement was small but deliberate. The wolves stopped immediately, their bodies tensing, their focus sharpening. He made another movement, this time stronger, pulling against the rope just enough to create sound, the creak of tension, the scrape of bark. Then he exhaled loudly, a deep, controlled sound that carried through the stillness of the forest. It was not a cry. It was not fear. It was presence. The effect was immediate. The closer wolf paused, its head lifting slightly, its confidence interrupted. The second one shifted backward, just a step, but enough to show hesitation. He had changed the balance, if only slightly. Pain became his tool. Every time he pulled against the rope, it cut deeper into his skin, but it also created movement, sound, resistance. He began to work the bindings not with force, but with persistence. Small shifts, twists of the wrist, pressing against the bark of the tree to create friction. The rope had been tied tight, but not perfectly. No knot is perfect when tested over time. He could feel it, just barely, a slight give in one of the loops around his wrist. It was not much, but it was something. Something meant possibility. The wolves watched, their interest now mixed with uncertainty. This was not the still weakening figure they had been waiting for. This was something active, something that refused to settle into the role they expected. They did not retreat completely, but they no longer closed the distance. The balance remained fragile, shifting with every movement he made. Time stretched again, but differently now. It was no longer just something to endure. It was something to use. Each small movement worked the rope a little more. Each controlled breath kept his mind clear, focused. The cold still pressed against him. The pain still lived in every part of his body, but neither controlled him. The wolves eventually slowed their circling, their curiosity fading into cautious distance. They lingered for a while longer, watching, waiting for weakness that never fully appeared. Then one by one they stepped back into the darkness from which they had come, their shapes dissolving into the forest until only the memory of their presence remained. He did not relax when they left. He did not allow relief to take over. The night was not finished with him yet, but he had survived one part of it, and that mattered. With the immediate danger gone, his focus returned fully to the rope. The slight looseness he had felt before became his entire world. He pressed his wrist against the bark again, twisting slowly, feeling the fibers strain, the knot shifting just enough to give him hope. It was a slow process, painful and exhausting, but it was movement. It was progress, and progress meant survival. The men who had left him there believed time would weaken him. They believed each passing hour would bring him closer to breaking. But as the night continued, something else was happening. Each hour was also bringing him closer to freedom. The forest remained dark, the cold remained sharp, the danger was not gone, but neither was he. The night had reached its deepest point, the hour when darkness feels heaviest and time itself seems unwilling to move forward. The cold had settled fully into his body now, no longer sharp but constant, a quiet pressure that slowed his muscles and tested his control. His arms burned from the strain of being held in place for so long, his wrists raw where the rope had cut into his skin, his legs stiff from standing without rest. Every part of him ached, yet none of it mattered as much as the small, fragile change he could feel in the binding around his wrist. It had loosened, not by much, but enough to give him something real, something to work with. He pressed his hand harder against the bark, twisting carefully, ignoring the pain as the rough surface scraped against his skin. The rope shifted slightly again. Not enough to free him, but enough to confirm what he already knew. It could be undone. It would be undone. The only question was whether he could finish before his strength ran out. He worked slowly, forcing himself to stay controlled. Rushing would only tighten the knots again or waste what little energy remained. Each movement was small, precise, deliberate. He twisted his wrist, pulled, relaxed, then twisted again, feeling for any weakness in the rope. The fibers were strong, but they were not unbreakable. They had been tied with confidence, not perfection. The men who bound him had believed time would do the rest of their work. They had not expected him to fight the rope itself. As he continued, the skin around his wrist tore further, the pain sharp and immediate. But he did not stop. Pain meant contact. Contact meant friction, and friction meant progress. Slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, one loop began to give more than the others. It loosened just enough for his hand to shift a fraction of an inch. That fraction became everything. He held still for a moment, breathing through the pain, then pulled again, harder this time, using every bit of strength he had saved. The rope resisted, then slipped. Just slightly, but it slipped. The shift changed everything. With one hand gaining even the smallest amount of movement, the balance of the restraint began to break. He forced his wrist through the narrow gap, ignoring the tearing sensation as skin scraped against rope and bark. The movement was slow, brutal, but unstoppable now. The loop that had held him for hours finally gave way enough for his hand to slide free. The moment his wrist broke through, he did not pause. He brought his arm forward immediately, working quickly to untangle the remaining knots before they could tighten again. His fingers were stiff, numb from the cold, but they still obeyed him. He pulled at the rope, unraveling it piece by piece, his breathing heavier now, driven by urgency. The forest around him remained dark and silent, but he knew that silence would not last forever. Morning would come, and with it, the men who had left him there. He could not still be bound when that happened. Once his hands were free, the rest came faster. He bent down, his body nearly collapsing as blood rushed back into his limbs, sending waves of pain through his legs. He worked quickly at the bindings around his ankles, his fingers clumsy but determined. The knots loosened under his grip, falling away one by one until the rope dropped to the ground. For a moment he remained there, crouched, breathing hard, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. He had done it. He had survived the night long enough to free himself. But survival was not finished yet. Escape was still ahead. The forest remained vast, unfamiliar, and filled with its own dangers. And somewhere beyond it, 7 men believed they would return to find him broken. That belief would not hold. Slowly, forcing his legs to respond, he stood. The world tilted for a second, his balance uncertain, but he steadied himself against the tree that had held him captive for so long. Then, without looking back, he stepped into the darkness. The forest that had once surrounded him as a prison now became his path. Each step was difficult, his muscles stiff, his body weakened. But he moved forward with quiet determination. He did not run. Running would waste what little strength he had left. Instead, he walked steadily, placing each foot carefully, listening as he moved, aware of every sound, every shift in the night around him. The sky above remained hidden behind the thick branches, but somewhere beyond them, morning was beginning its slow approach. He could not see it yet, but he could feel it. Time was moving again. The same hours the men had trusted to break him had instead carried him through to this moment. And as he disappeared deeper into the forest, leaving behind the tree, the rope, and the place where they believed he would fall, one truth became clear. They had not broken him. They had made a mistake they would not understand until it was far too late. Morning arrived slowly, pushing its way through the dense forest with pale light that filtered between the branches and touched the ground in broken pieces. The cold of the night began to lift, replaced by a damp stillness that carried the scent of earth and leaves. Birds stirred somewhere high above, their distant calls signaling the return of day. But on the forest floor, the silence felt heavier than before. It was the kind of silence that follows something unfinished. The place where the tree stood remained unchanged in appearance, the rope still hanging loosely from its trunk, the ground marked by the long hours of struggle that had taken place there. To anyone arriving without knowledge of the night, it might have seemed like nothing more than a forgotten spot in the wilderness. But to those who had left a man there, it was meant to be a place of conclusion. The sound of hooves broke the stillness not long after sunrise. The 7 men returned exactly as they had planned, riding with the same confidence they had carried the night before. Their movements were calm, their expressions untouched by doubt. They expected to find what they had left, a man weakened, broken, perhaps already lifeless. One of them laughed quietly as they approached, speaking of how the cold and fear would have done the work for them. Another mentioned how quickly strength fades when hope is removed. They spoke as if the outcome had already been decided, as if the night itself had been their ally. But as they reached the clearing and saw the tree, something shifted. The laughter stopped. The calm expressions tightened, because the man was not there. For a moment, none of them spoke. Their eyes moved from the empty space where he had been tied, to the rope hanging loose, to the ground marked by movement. One of them dismounted quickly, stepping forward to examine the bindings. He touched the rope, running his fingers along the frayed edges where it had been forced loose. His expression changed, not to anger immediately, but to something more unsettling. Realization. This had not been an accident. This had not been outside interference. The man had freed himself. The idea settled into the space between them, heavy and undeniable. Another man cursed under his breath, turning sharply to scan the surrounding forest as if the missing figure might still be standing somewhere nearby. But the trees offered nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the quiet presence of a wilderness that had already allowed him to disappear. The confidence they had carried into the forest began to fracture. One of them spoke again, this time with urgency, suggesting they track him immediately before he could get far. Another agreed, pointing to faint disturbances in the ground that marked the direction he had taken. They mounted their horses again, moving quickly now, their control replaced by something closer to frustration. They had believed the night would finish the task for them. They had believed fear and isolation would succeed where force had not fully done the job. But the truth stood before them in the form of absence. The man they had tied, the man they had left to break, had endured everything they had planned for him and had still found a way out. That reality carried something dangerous. It meant they had underestimated him. It meant their control had limits. And for men who built their lives on the belief that they could not be challenged, that realization was difficult to accept. They followed the trail as far as they could, pushing through the forests, searching for signs, for anything that might lead them back to what they had lost. But the deeper they went, the less certain the path became. The forest swallowed tracks quickly. Leaves shifted, ground softened. What had once been clear signs began to fade into nothing. Hours passed, and with each passing hour, the truth grew harder to deny. He was gone, not captured, not broken. Gone. By midday, the search slowed. Frustration turned into silence. One by one, they began to understand that the night had not worked in their favor. It had worked against them. The very thing they had trusted to weaken him had given him the time he needed to survive. And somewhere beyond their reach, the man they had left behind was still moving forward. As they turned back, their earlier confidence gone, replaced by something quieter and heavier, the forest remained unchanged. It did not reveal where he had gone. It did not offer answers. It simply stood, holding its silence as it always had. But one thing had changed, whether they admitted it or not. The balance they believed they controlled had shifted. The man they thought would break had endured. The fear they had tried to create had not taken hold the way they expected. And in that failure, something else had been created. Something they could not easily chase down or destroy. The understanding that even in the darkest conditions, even when everything is taken away, there are some who refuse to be broken. The story did not remain in the forest. It could not. Events like that, even when hidden, even when unspoken in public, have a way of moving beyond the place where they begin. At first, it traveled slowly, carried in fragments by those who had seen the aftermath or heard the anger in the voices of the 7 men who returned without what they expected. A missing man was not unusual in those times, but the way he had disappeared was different. There had been certainty in what was supposed to happen. There had been control, and yet something had gone wrong. That alone made people listen more closely. The details were not shared openly, but they were passed carefully from one person to another in quiet conversations that never lasted too long and never drew attention. A man had been tied, left in the forest, meant to be broken, and somehow he had freed himself and vanished. Among the enslaved and those who lived closest to that harsh reality, the story carried a different weight. It was not just about survival. It was about defiance in its most raw form. It spoke of a moment when everything had been stripped away, when there was no help, no witness, no safety, and still the man had endured. He had not waited for rescue. He had not surrendered to fear. He had acted. That idea settled into the minds of those who heard it. Not loudly, not as something to be celebrated in the open, but as something to hold on to. Something that reminded them that strength could exist even in isolation. That the human will, when pushed to its limits, could still find a way forward. The story did not need a name. It did not need a place marked on a map. It existed in the understanding of what had happened. And that was enough. For those who held power, the story created a different kind of reaction. It was not something they spoke about directly, but it stayed with them. The thought that a man could survive such a situation, that he could break free from carefully tied restraints and disappear into the wilderness, challenged the idea of complete control. It suggested that fear was not always reliable, that even when everything seemed certain, there were still outcomes that could not be predicted or contained. Some responded by tightening their grip, increasing punishments, reinforcing the systems they relied on. Others grew quieter, more cautious, aware that not everything could be managed as easily as they once believed. The story moved through both worlds, touching them in different ways, shaping thoughts without ever being fully acknowledged. As time passed, the details began to shift, as stories often do. In some versions, the forest itself seemed to aid the man, hiding him, protecting him, guiding his steps away from those who hunted him. In others, his strength grew almost beyond human, his ability to endure pain and cold, described in ways that made him seem more simple than man. But beneath all the variations, the truth remained the same. He had been left to break, and he had not broken. That truth was simple, but it carried more power than any embellishment. It did not need to be changed to matter. It did not need to grow into something larger to have meaning. It was already enough. The man himself was never seen again by those 7 men. Whether he reached safety, whether he continued to move through the forests and fields, whether he found a place where he could live without fear, no one could say for certain. His path disappeared into the same silence that had once surrounded him in the night, but his absence became its own kind of presence. The fact that he was not found, not recaptured, not broken, turned him into something that could not be easily dismissed. He became a question that remained unanswered, a reminder that outcomes are not always controlled by those who believe they hold power. And in that way, the story endured, not written in official records, not preserved in documents or spoken in places where history was formally recorded, but carried in memory, in quiet understanding, in the knowledge that even in a world built to break people, there are moments when someone refuses to be broken, moments when endurance becomes action, when survival becomes resistance, and when a single night can leave a mark that lasts far longer than anyone expected. Time moved forward, as it always does, carrying the world with it, whether people were ready or not. The forests remained, the roads stretched on, and the systems that shaped that era continued to press down on countless lives. Yet some moments refuse to disappear completely, no matter how deeply they are buried. The night in 1862, when one man was left tied between trees and expected to break, did not vanish with the passing years. It settled into memory, into quiet conversations, into the understanding shared by those who recognized its meaning. It was not recorded in official accounts. It was not preserved in books written by those in power. But it lived on where it mattered most, in the awareness that something unexpected had happened, something that could not be easily explained away or ignored. The man himself remained without a name in history, yet his story carried more weight than many names that were remembered. He became a symbol, not because he sought to be one, but because of what he had endured and what he had refused to become. He had been placed in a position where everything was meant to strip him of control, of hope, of strength. Bound, isolated, surrounded by darkness and danger, he had been expected to surrender to the conditions forced upon him. But he did not. He endured the cold. He faced the fear. He studied the silence of the forest and used it instead of being consumed by it. He turned pain into movement, movement into action, and action into escape. That transformation from victim to survivor carried a meaning far beyond that single night. It spoke to something deeper, something that cannot be easily broken, even when everything else is taken away. For those who heard the story, whether in fragments or in fuller form, it became a reminder of what human endurance truly means. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to continue despite it. Not the absence of suffering, but the refusal to let suffering define the outcome. In a time when cruelty was often used as a tool of control, this story stood quietly against that idea. It showed that control is never absolute, that even in the most carefully constructed situations, there are limits. The 7 men who had believed they understood exactly how the night would unfold learned that truth in the most direct way possible. They had relied on fear. They had relied on isolation. They had relied on the belief that a man alone in the wilderness would have no choice but to break. And they were wrong. That failure did not just belong to them. It belonged to the system that had taught them to believe such things were certain. As the years passed and the world began to change, stories like this became part of a larger, quieter history. a history not always written, but always present, a history carried by those who lived through it, who understood that survival itself could be an act of resistance. The unnamed man's escape did not end the suffering of others. It did not dismantle the systems that had placed him in that position. But it did something that should not be underestimated. It proved that even within those systems, even under the weight of fear and power, there were moments when the expected outcome did not happen. Moments when the human spirit refused to follow the path laid out for it. Those moments matter. They accumulate. They shape the way people think, the way they endure, the way they act when their own moment arrives. In the end, the forest kept its silence. It did not reveal where the man went. It did not offer closure or confirmation of his fate. But perhaps that is part of the story itself. Not every story needs a final destination to have meaning. Sometimes the most powerful part is the moment when everything could have ended one way and did not. The moment when a man left alone under the cold night sky chose to fight in the only ways he could and succeeded. As the sun rose over that forest on the morning after, it did not shine on a broken body as 7 men had expected. It shone on an empty space, a loose rope, and a truth they could not change. He had survived. He had escaped. And in doing so, he left behind something stronger than fear. Thank you for watching Shadows of Black History. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe and like the channel so more hidden stories can be told. And always remember, history is not only found in what is written, it is also found in what is endured, in what is survived, and in the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken. They thought the swamp would trap them. They thought the mud, the darkness, and the water would finish what the chains had started. 3 brothers ran with nothing left but each other and the will to survive. Behind them, hunters closed in with dogs, guns, and certainty. But that night, the swamp did not belong to the hunters. Welcome to Shadows of Black History. If you are new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe and like our videos so you never miss the hidden stories that shape the past. We truly appreciate every single one of you who watches and supports this journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight's story is one you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. Stay with us until the very end, because what you are about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about survival, courage, and brotherhood. So relax, settle in, and let us begin. The swamp stretched like a living maze across the lowlands, thick with cypress trees, hanging moss, and dark water that reflected almost nothing back to the eye. In the deep South during the early 1850s, these swamps were both feared and respected. Even those who lived nearby rarely entered them without purpose. The ground could vanish beneath a single step. The water could rise without warning. And the silence, broken only by insects and distant splashes, carried a weight that made even strong men uneasy. But on that night, the swamp became something else. It became the last refuge for 3 brothers who had already outrun everything behind them except the one thing that refused to let them go, the hunt. Samuel, the eldest, moved first, pushing through thick reeds and tangled roots with a determination that came from years of quiet endurance. Behind him came Josiah, his breath heavy, his eyes burning with a mix of fear and anger that had been building for far too long. And last was Eli, younger, smaller, but driven by a will that refused to break even as his body struggled to keep up. They had not planned to enter the swamp. Their escape had been meant to follow a narrow path through wooded land, guided by whispered directions passed carefully from one trusted voice to another. But plans rarely survive the moment they are tested. The sound of dogs had come sooner than expected, sharp and relentless, cutting through the night with terrifying clarity. The hunters were close, closer than anyone had hoped. The brothers had reached the edge of the swamp with no time left to debate. Samuel had looked at the dark water, then back at his brothers, and made the only decision left to him. Forward, into the unknown. The first step had been the hardest, the cold water rising around his legs, the mud pulling at his feet as if trying to hold him in place. But once that step was taken, there was no turning back. One by one they followed, disappearing into a world where the rules of the land no longer applied. Behind them, The hunters arrived at the edge of the swamp with far less hesitation. These were not ordinary men. They were experienced trackers, men who had spent years chasing others across difficult terrain. They trusted their dogs, trusted their weapons, trusted the belief that no one could outrun them for long. When they saw the footprints leading into the water, they did not stop. They saw desperation, not strategy. One of them laughed quietly, certain that the swamp would do most of the work for them. Another tightened his grip on the rope coiled at his side, already imagining the moment the brothers would be dragged back. The dogs barked louder, pulling against the restraints, eager to continue the chase. Without waiting, the hunters stepped forward, following the trail into the swamp, unaware that they had just crossed into a place where control could slip away without warning. Inside the swamp, the brothers moved carefully but quickly, guided by instinct and the faint understanding Samuel had gathered from stories whispered long ago. He knew the swamp could hide them, but only if they respected it. Every step had to be chosen. Every sound had to be measured. The water reached higher in some places, forcing them to wade slowly, while in others the ground rose just enough to allow quicker movement. Mosquitoes swarmed around them, biting at exposed skin, but they could not afford to react. The sound of the dogs grew louder, then strangely distant, then loud again as it echoed through the trees in confusing patterns. Eli stumbled once, falling to his knees as the mud gave way beneath him. But Josiah pulled him up immediately, his grip firm, his voice low and urgent. "Stay up, stay moving." Samuel did not look back, but he heard everything. The splashes, the breathing, the distant shouts, and beneath it all, something else. The swamp was not just quiet, it was watching. The deeper they moved into the swamp, the more the world behind them began to fade. The open land, the roads, the familiar sounds of life beyond the trees, all seemed to disappear, replaced by something thicker, heavier, almost alive. The air grew damp and harder to breathe, each step pulling more strength from their bodies as the mud clung to their legs and the water resisted their movement. Samuel slowed slightly, raising his hand to signal caution. The swamp was changing. The ground beneath them felt softer, less certain, and the trees grew closer together, their roots twisting above the surface like traps waiting to catch the careless. He turned his head just enough to speak in a low voice, telling his brothers to step where he stepped, to avoid the darker patches of water, to trust nothing that looked still. Josiah nodded, his jaw tight, while Eli focused on each movement with intense concentration, forcing himself to ignore the exhaustion building in his limbs. Behind them, the sounds of the chase continued, but something about those sounds had shifted. The dogs were no longer moving with the same steady rhythm. Their barking came in bursts now, uneven, uncertain, as if even they were beginning to question the ground beneath them. The hunters pressed forward, but their confidence began to show its first cracks. The swamp did not behave like the land they were used to. Tracks disappeared into water. Broken branches led nowhere. The dogs pulled in different directions, confused by scents that drifted and scattered across the damp air. One of the men cursed under his breath as his foot sank deep into the mud, forcing him to struggle free with a sharp pull. Another warned the others to spread out, but not too far, their voices carrying tension that had not been there before. They could still hear signs of movement ahead, faint splashes, the rustle of disturbed water, but the distance between them and their prey no longer felt predictable. The swamp twisted sound, bending it in strange ways, making it seem closer or farther than it truly was. One hunter paused, looking around with narrowed eyes as if trying to read the land itself. He had been in swamps before, but this felt different. This felt like stepping into something that did not want them there. Samuel sensed the shift before he saw it. The water ahead widened into a darker stretch, still and thick, with no clear path through. He stopped abruptly, forcing the others to halt behind him. For a moment they stood in silence, listening. The swamp responded with its usual quiet, broken only by distant movement and the faint hum of insects. But beneath that, Samuel felt something else, a warning. He crouched slowly, reaching down with a long branch he had picked up earlier, pressing it into the water ahead. The branch sank deeper than expected, disappearing into soft ground that would not support their weight. He pulled it back and moved slightly to the side, testing again. This time, the branch met resistance. A narrow path, hidden beneath the surface, just firm enough to hold. He motioned for his brothers to follow closely, stepping carefully onto the barely visible trail. Each step had to be exact. Too far to the left or right, and the ground would give way. Eli's breathing quickened as he realized how narrow their margin for survival had become. Josiah stayed close behind, his focus sharp, his earlier anger now replaced with something colder and more controlled. They moved slowly, silently, guided by Samuel's steady hand and quiet judgment. Behind them, the hunters reached the same stretch of water, but without the knowledge that now guided the brothers. One of the dogs lunged forward, pulling hard against its leash, eager to continue the chase. The hunter, holding it, stepped forward without testing the ground, his boots sinking instantly into the soft mud beneath the water. He stumbled, cursing loudly as he struggled to regain his balance. The second hunter tried to move around him, but his footing slipped as well, sending both men crashing into the dark water with a heavy splash. The dogs barked wildly, their movements frantic as they pulled in different directions, confused and agitated. The third hunter shouted orders, trying to regain control, but the swamp did not respond to authority. It responded to missteps, and now those missteps were beginning to multiply. The noise they created echoed through the trees, loud and chaotic, a sharp contrast to the careful silence of the three brothers moving steadily ahead. For the first time since the chase began, the advantage had shifted. The hunters were no longer closing in. They were falling behind. The swamp grew darker the deeper they moved, not just from the fading night, but from the thick canopy above that blocked what little light remained. The trees leaned inward, their branches heavy with hanging moss that brushed against faces and shoulders like unseen hands. The air felt heavier here, harder to breathe, thick with moisture in the scent of still water. Samuel continued forward, slower now, more deliberate, his eyes scanning every inch of ground before placing his foot down. He could feel the swamp shifting beneath them, not in movement, but in presence, as if they had crossed into a part of it that did not forgive mistakes. Behind him, Josiah and Eli followed in silence, their earlier fear beginning to change into something else. Not comfort, not safety, but understanding. The swamp was not just hiding them, it was confusing the men behind them, and that confusion was growing. Samuel suddenly raised his hand again, signaling them to stop. Ahead, the land opened slightly into a shallow stretch of water broken by clusters of roots rising like islands. The path forward was not clear, but it was not impossible. He crouched low, studying the water, watching how it moved, how it settled around certain points. Then he turned slightly and whispered for them to spread out, not far, but enough to avoid stepping in the exact same place. It was a risk, but a necessary one. If they left too clear a trail, the hunters might regain direction. Josiah understood immediately, moving to the left with careful steps, while Eli stayed slightly to the right, his movements slower but controlled. Samuel remained between them, guiding with quiet gestures, ensuring they stayed within sight of one another. They moved like this for several minutes, each step breaking the pattern that trackers depended on. Their footprints would no longer form a single line. Their path would no longer be obvious. The swamp would take the rest. Behind them, the hunters struggled to regain control of the chase. Wet, frustrated, and now cautious, they moved more slowly than before. The dogs, once certain and aggressive, had become restless and confused, pulling in different directions, whining at scents that no longer made sense. One hunter tried to force them forward, but the animals resisted, their instincts warning them of something the men refused to fully accept. The tracks had begun to disappear. What had once been a clear trail had turned into scattered signs, broken water, disturbed mud that led nowhere. One of the men knelt down, trying to read the ground, but the swamp offered no clear answers. Every step the brothers had taken was being softened, blurred, erased by the water itself. The hunter stood slowly, his expression tightening as he realized what was happening. They were losing the trail. The advantage they had carried into the swamp was slipping away, replaced by uncertainty that grew heavier with each passing moment. Then the swamp answered again. One of the hunters, moving too quickly despite the warning signs, stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground. For a brief second it held. Then it gave way. His leg plunged deep into the mud, pulling him down with sudden force. He shouted, struggling to pull himself free, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank. The other two rushed to help, grabbing his arms, pulling with all their strength as the mud resisted, thick and unyielding. The dogs barked wildly, circling in panic, their noise echoing through the trees in sharp, chaotic bursts. It took all three men working together to free him, dragging him back onto firmer ground, his clothes soaked, his breath heavy with fear and anger. For the first time, none of them spoke. The realization did not need words. The swamp was no longer just difficult terrain. It was dangerous, and it was winning. Ahead, the brothers paused briefly, listening. The noise behind them had changed. It was no longer the steady pursuit they had feared. It was scattered, strained, uncertain. Samuel allowed himself a single breath of relief, but only a small one. The swamp had given them an opening, but it would not protect them forever. They needed to go deeper, to reach a place where the land itself would hide them completely. He turned to his brothers, his voice low but firm, telling them they were not done yet. Josiah nodded, his expression focused, his earlier anger now replaced by determination. Eli, though exhausted, straightened slightly, pushing through the pain in his legs. They moved forward again, disappearing further into the tangled maze of water and roots. Behind them, the hunters stood in the dark, surrounded by a land that no longer belonged to them, slowly beginning to understand that this chase had become something else entirely. The swamp tightened around them as if it had been waiting for this moment. The water grew deeper in places, rising to their knees, then to their thighs, while the ground beneath shifted between firm patches and sudden drops that threatened to pull them under. The trees stood closer now, their thick trunks forming narrow corridors that twisted in unpredictable directions. The air carried a strange stillness, heavier than before, as though even the insects had grown quiet. Samuel slowed again, not from exhaustion, but from awareness. They had reached a part of the swamp where movement alone would not be enough. This was where decisions mattered most. He looked ahead and saw what he had been searching for. A cluster of cypress roots rising above the water, large enough to hold their weight, tangled enough to hide them from view. It was not an escape, but it was something else. A place to stop, to think, to turn the chase in a different direction. He guided his brothers toward the roots, stepping carefully until they reached the raised ground. From there, they could see just enough through the trees to track movement without being seen easily. Samuel lowered himself into a crouch and motioned for silence. The sounds behind them had grown louder again, not closer in distance, but sharper in tension. The hunters were still coming, but not with the same confidence they had before. They moved slower now, calling out to one another more often, their voices edged with frustration. The dogs barked less frequently, their earlier aggression replaced by hesitation. Josiah leaned closer, whispering that they could keep moving, that they might still outrun them completely. But Samuel shook his head. Running had brought them this far, but running alone would not end the chase. The swamp had already begun to work in their favor. Now they needed to let it do more. Behind them, the hunters pushed forward with growing unease. Every step felt uncertain, every sound harder to trust. One of them suggested turning back, his voice low, almost reluctant. But the idea was quickly rejected. Pride, anger, and the fear of returning empty-handed drove them forward. They had come too far to leave without something to show for it. Yet even as they continued, their movements betrayed doubt. They tested the ground more often, paused more frequently, and spoke in quieter tones as if the swamp itself might be listening. The dogs, once leading the way, now stayed closer to their handlers, their ears alert, their bodies tense. The trail was nearly gone. What remained was only a sense of direction, a belief that the brothers were still ahead, somewhere in the maze of water and trees. That belief was the only thing keeping them moving. Samuel watched them approach through the narrow openings between the trees. He could see the way they moved, cautious now, uncertain. He could hear the strain in their voices, the frustration building beneath their control. He turned to his brothers and spoke quietly, explaining what they needed to do. They would not run, they would wait. The swamp would carry their scent, distort their sound, and confuse their path. If they remained still, if they trusted the land instead of fighting it, the hunters would begin to lose direction completely. It was a risk, but so was everything else they had done. Josiah hesitated for a moment, his instincts still pushing him toward action, but then he nodded. Eli said nothing, but his eyes showed understanding. They settled into silence, their bodies still, their breathing controlled, becoming part of the swamp rather than something moving through it. The hunters passed closer than expected, their figures emerging through the trees, their lantern casting weak light across the water. For a brief moment it seemed as if they might see the brothers, might notice the shapes hidden among the roots. One of them stopped, turning his head slowly, listening. The swamp held its breath. The water barely moved. Even the faint sounds of insects seemed to fade. Then, without finding what he was searching for, the hunter turned away. They continued forward, deeper into the swamp, following a path that no longer existed. Their voices grew fainter as they moved, their directions slowly shifting away from the place where the brothers remained hidden. Minutes passed, then more. The sounds of the chase did not return. The swamp had taken them in a different direction, one that would not lead back easily. Samuel waited longer, making sure the silence was real, not temporary. Only when he was certain did he finally move, rising slowly and signaling his brothers to follow. They stepped down from the roots and turned in the opposite direction, moving carefully but with new purpose. The swamp no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a shield. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, the hunters were still searching, still calling out, still trying to regain control of a chase they had already lost. And ahead, for the first time since they had begun to run, there was something else waiting. Not certainty, not safety, but a path that no longer led back. The swamp did not release its grip easily, especially on those who did not understand it. The hunters moved deeper without realizing it, their sense of direction slowly unraveling with each step. What had once felt like forward progress now circled back on itself. The same twisted trees appeared again. The same patches of dark water reflected their lantern light in familiar ways. One of the men stopped suddenly, turning in place as he tried to recognize something, anything that could guide them back. But the swamp did not offer clear signs. It erased them. The dogs, once eager and loud, had grown quiet, their movements uncertain, their noses no longer able to follow a trail that had been swallowed by water and time. Frustration turned to anger, and anger slowly gave way to something deeper, something harder to admit. They were lost. The realization settled heavily between them, unspoken at first, then voiced in sharp, tense exchanges that carried through the still air. The hunt was over, but they had not accepted it yet. Far from them, moving carefully in the opposite direction, the three brothers continued through the swamp with a different kind of awareness. Samuel no longer rushed. He moved with patience, reading the land in ways that came from instinct and careful observation. He watched how the water flowed, how the trees thinned in certain directions, how the ground rose just enough to suggest firmer paths ahead. Josiah followed closely, his earlier urgency replaced by focus, while Eli, though exhausted, matched their pace with quiet determination. The sounds behind them had faded completely now. No barking, no shouting, no movement that suggested pursuit. Still, Samuel did not allow them to relax. The swamp was not finished with them yet. It demanded respect until the very end. He led them toward a stretch where the trees began to space out slightly, where the water grew shallower and the ground beneath felt more solid with each step. It was not obvious, not something a stranger would notice. But to Samuel, it was enough. They were nearing the edge. Back in the depths of the swamp, the hunters faced a different reality. Their lantern burned lower, its light weaker, casting long, uncertain shadows that made every movement harder to trust. One of the men insisted they should turn back, retrace their steps, but the others argued that they had already lost that path. Every direction looked the same now. Every choice felt like a guess. The swamp had taken their certainty and replaced it with doubt. One of the dogs let out a low whine, pulling back instead of forward, its instincts now pushing against the men who held its leash. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the swamp itself had closed in around them. They began to move more cautiously, not in pursuit, but in search of a way out. The hunt that had begun with confidence had turned into something else entirely. Survival. And in that shift, the balance of power had fully changed. At the edge of the swamp, the brothers emerged slowly, almost cautiously, as if expecting the land to pull them back in. The ground beneath their feet felt different, firmer, more certain. The trees thinned, allowing more light to break through the canopy above. The air moved more freely, carrying the scent of open land rather than still water. For a moment, none of them spoke. They simply stood there, breathing, listening, making sure it was real. Then Eli let out a quiet, almost disbelieving breath. They had made it. Not through strength alone, not through speed, but through something else entirely. Through trust, through patience, through understanding that survival sometimes meant letting the world around you become your ally. Samuel looked back once toward the dark wall of trees behind them. Somewhere inside, the hunters were still moving, still trying to find their way out. But the swamp no longer concerned him. It had done what it needed to do. As the sun began to rise, casting the first light of morning across the land, the brothers turned away from the swamp and began walking toward the unknown. They did not know exactly where they would go next. They did not know what dangers still waited ahead. But they knew one thing with certainty. They were no longer being chased. The hunt had ended in a way no one had expected. The hunters had entered the swamp believing it would trap their prey. Instead, it had trapped them. And the three brothers, once running for their lives, now walked forward with something they had not felt since before the chains. A chance. The story did not stay in the swamp. It moved the way stories always do in places where truth must travel quietly, carried by voices that understand both its power and its danger. It began with small details. A hunter returning late, soaked and shaken, speaking less than expected. Another arriving days later with little to say except that the swamp had turned against them. No captured men, no reward, no victory to report. That alone was enough to raise questions. In towns and along dirt roads, people began to whisper. Something had gone wrong. Something had not followed the usual pattern. For those who depended on control, that kind of uncertainty was unsettling. But for others, those who lived under that control, it meant something else entirely. It meant that for once, the story had ended differently. Among enslaved communities, the tale grew carefully, shaped by each telling but anchored in the same truth. Three brothers had run. They had been chased into the swamp, and they had not been caught. Some said the swamp itself had hidden them, confusing the dogs and swallowing their trail. Others said the brothers had known the land in a way the hunters never could. The details changed depending on who spoke, but the meaning remained strong. It was not just a story of escape. It was a story of survival against odds that were meant to be impossible. It was a reminder that even in a world designed to close every path, some paths still existed. Hidden, difficult, but real. The story was never spoken loudly. It did not need to be. Its strength lived in quiet understanding, in the way it settled into the minds of those who heard it. The hunters, for their part, did not forget what had happened. When they finally found their way out of the swamp, it was not with pride or confidence, but with a silence that spoke louder than any story they might have told. They avoided speaking about the details, avoided admitting how completely the land had taken control of the situation. But the change in them was visible. They moved more cautiously in the months that followed. They hesitated at the edges of unfamiliar terrain. They listened more closely when warnings were given. The swamp had not just slowed them. It had taught them something they could not ignore. Not every place could be controlled. Not every chase could be won. As for the brothers, their journey continued beyond the swamp, into a world still filled with danger, but no longer defined by pursuit. They moved carefully, relying on the same instincts that had carried them through the night. Along the way, they found moments of help, small acts of kindness offered quietly by those who understood what they had risked. Food shared without question, directions given in low voices, shelter offered for a single night before moving on again. Each step carried them farther from the life they had left behind, though the memory of it remained close. They did not speak often about the swamp, but they did not need to. It lived in the way they moved, in the way they trusted each other, in the understanding that they had survived something that had been meant to end them. Over time, the story of the three brothers became something more than an event. It became a symbol, not of defiance alone, but of the power of unity and awareness. They had not survived because one was stronger than the others. They had survived because they stayed together, because they listened, because they adapted. That lesson traveled with the story, carried forward into other lives, other journeys, other moments where choices had to be made in the face of fear. The swamp, once seen only as a place of danger, became something different in those quiet retellings. It became a place where the balance had shifted, where the hunted had become unseen, and where survival had taken root in the most unlikely ground. Years passed, but the story never faded. It settled into memory the way roots settle into soil, quiet but strong, holding its place even as time moved forward. The swamp remained where it had always been, stretching across the lowlands, dark and watchful, unchanged in its appearance, yet forever marked by what had happened within it. Those who lived nearby still spoke of it carefully, not as a place to be conquered, but as a place to be respected. And when the story of the three brothers was told, it was never told as something ordinary. It was told as something rare, a moment when everything that was supposed to happen did not happen. A moment when the outcome shifted, not through luck, but through choice, unity, and understanding. The brothers themselves became part of that quiet legacy. Their names were not written in records, and their journey did not appear in official accounts, but they lived on in the way their story was carried. Some said they reached freedom far to the north. Others believed they remained hidden within communities that protected them, building new lives in places where their past could not easily follow. The truth of where they ended mattered less than the truth of what they had done. They had refused to be separated. They had trusted each other when fear could have broken them apart. And when they were pushed into a place meant to end them, they had listened, adapted, and survived. That lesson stayed alive in every retelling, passed quietly from one voice to another, shaping the way others thought about their own chances, their own choices. In the years that followed, as tensions across the nation grew and the foundations of the system began to crack, stories like theirs became part of something larger. They were reminders that resistance did not always look the same. Sometimes it was loud and visible. Sometimes it was silent and unseen. But it was always present. The story of the swamp carried a particular kind of strength. It showed that survival was not only about fighting harder or running faster. It was about understanding the world around you, about knowing when to move and when to remain still, about trusting those beside you even when everything else felt uncertain. These were lessons that reached beyond that single night, beyond that single place, into a broader understanding of what it meant to endure. One evening, long after the night of the chase, an old man sat near the edge of a different stretch of land, far from the swamp, but not far from its memory. He spoke quietly to a small group gathered around him, telling a story about three brothers who had once been hunted and had walked into darkness without knowing what waited inside. He described the sound of dogs, the weight of fear, the way the land itself seemed to shift beneath their feet. And then he spoke of how they had stayed together, how they had listened, how they had trusted something beyond fear. The listeners leaned in, not because the story was new, but because it carried something they needed to hear. When the man finished, he looked at them for a long moment and said that the world will always try to tell you where you cannot go, what you cannot survive, who you cannot be. But sometimes, if you hold on to each other, if you move with wisdom instead of panic, you will find that even the darkest places can lead you forward. And so the story endured. Not in books, not in official history, but in memory, in quiet voices, in the understanding passed from one generation to the next. On one night in the early 1850s, three brothers were chased into a swamp with the intention of never leaving it alive. But what happened next was something the hunters never expected. The swamp did not claim them. It did not betray them. Instead, it became their shield, their guide, and their escape. And in that moment, hidden beneath trees and water and darkness, the balance shifted just enough to remind the world that even in its harshest forms, it cannot fully control those who refuse to give up. Thank you for watching Shadows of Black History. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe and like the channel so more hidden stories from the past can be told. And always remember, history is not only written in power, it is carried in survival, in unity, and in the quiet strength of those who found a way forward when none was meant to exist. Part 8. Time carried the story forward the way it always does, quietly, steadily, shaping it without ever erasing its truth. The land changed, the years moved, and the world that once hunted men through swamps and forests began to shift under the weight of growing conflict. But even as history unfolded in larger, louder ways, the story of the three brothers remained alive in quieter spaces. It was told in cabins late at night, in hushed voices between trusted friends, in moments where fear needed to be answered with something stronger. It was not told as legend alone. It was told as proof. Proof that survival was possible even when the odds were meant to be final. In those retellings, new details sometimes appeared, shaped by imagination or memory, but the heart of the story never changed. Three brothers entered the swamp together. They did not break apart. They did not panic when the darkness closed around them. They listened. They adapted. They trusted each other. And because of that, they walked out while those who chased them lost their way. That lesson became more important with each passing year. It was not just about escape. It was about how to survive in a world that constantly shifted, a world where danger did not always come from one direction, and safety was never guaranteed. The swamp became a symbol in those conversations, not just of danger, but of possibility. A place where the rules of the outside world did not always apply. For some, the story sparked quiet courage. It encouraged others to take chances they might not have considered before, to move carefully, to plan, to trust in something beyond fear. Not every attempt ended the same way. Many faced consequences that were harsh and unforgiving. But the story still mattered. It reminded people that even in the darkest conditions, the outcome was not always certain. That uncertainty became a form of strength. It gave space for hope to exist where it had once been pushed out completely. And hope, even in small amounts, can change the way people see the world around them. The swamp itself remained unchanged, silent and watchful as it had always been. Those who passed near it in later years sometimes felt something they could not explain, a sense that the place held more than just water and trees. It held memory. It held stories that could not be seen but could still be felt. And among those stories, the night of the three brothers stood out. Not because it was the only one, but because it showed something rare. It showed that even when everything seemed lost, there were still moments where the world could shift in unexpected ways. And so the story continued to travel, carried not by those who sought recognition, but by those who understood its meaning. It moved through generations, through changing times, through new struggles and new hopes. It remained a quiet reminder that survival is not always about strength alone. It is about awareness, unity, and the courage to move forward even when the path is unclear. The three brothers were never meant to leave that swamp alive. That was the plan. That was the certainty of the hunters. But what happened instead became something far greater than a single escape. It became a lasting truth. That even in a world built to confine, there are places where freedom can still be found.